Donc, nous avons le plaisir d'entendre maintenant Hasana Sharp. We now will have a presentation by Hasana Sharp, who is Associate Professor at McGill University, and among other achievements, has published some time ago this wonderful book called Spinoza and the Politics of Renaturalization. Today, Hasana will speak about Spinozan generosity.
Merci beaucoup. Grand remerciement aux organisateurs pour l'invitation à penser ensemble. C'est vraiment magnifique. I'm happy to be here, especially because I am kind of a product of the Spinozism of France and US, and I would also say of the feminisme australien. So it's nice to be here in the nexus of my being. Okay, so this is a new paper, so I really invite feedback and challenge and assistance. Thank you. Okay, in this paper, through attention to the virtue of generosity, I offer an alternative to the solution to the puzzle Daniel Garber presents in his paper on sociability and freedom in Spinoza's Ethics. Garber identifies attention with Spinoza's doctrine, according to which 1, freedom is the ability to be an adequate cause of one's own actions, and 2, freedom entails the desire for friendship, society, and mutual aid. Freedom as adequate causation seems to imply self-sufficiency, but Spinoza frequently links the desire for sociability to our ineluctable lack of self-sufficiency. In the political treatise, Spinoza observes that, quote, "It is vain for one man to try to guard himself against all others," end quote, and for this reason, each of us intrinsically fears solitude. In the Ethics, immediately after invoking the adage, "Man is a god to man," Spinoza's thoughts turn to the prosaic. Quote, "Men still find by experience that by helping each other they can provide themselves much more easily with the things they require, and that only by joining forces can they avoid the dangers which threaten on all sides," end quote. Society thus appears to be a response to our vulnerability and finitude. Spinoza often frames the desire for society in negative terms, as a mode of protection from violence, the elements, and deprivation, protection from which is necessary given the limited powers of individuals. But Spinoza also positively aligns freedom, rationality, and sociability throughout his writings. Spinoza asserts that one who exercises virtue, understood as the power and freedom proper to one's nature, necessarily strives for society and the well-being of others. Quote, "The good which everyone who seeks virtue wants for himself, he also desires for other men," end quote. The guidance of reason directs each person to persevere in her own being and concomitantly to pursue the shared enjoyment of common goods. Despite Spinoza's multiple assertions that rationality entails sociability, Garber finds, or at least he found many years ago, that, quote, "he has no real arguments to that conclusion," end quote. Garber thus proposes the following: sociability, cooperation, and interdependence follow from one's desire for freedom, but not from its attainment. While sociability is a necessary means to freedom, it is not a consequence of it. Since sociability involves dependency on others rather than self-sufficiency, it expresses our neediness rather than our power. Attention to generosity as an expression of freedom, I suggest, points toward a different way to dissolve the dilemma. It is certainly true that Spinoza often argues from our finitude to the necessity and indissolubility of social order in general. Nevertheless, need is not the only basis of sociability. Insofar as we are rational, free, and virtuous, we exercise hard-won social skills such as generosity. Generosity, defined in 3P59S, as the rational desire to aid other men and join them in friendship, is a potent art of joining together with others that is no less difficult and rare than the other practices of natural science. Generosity, I hope to show, is not best understood as an alliance of forces necessary for mortal beings with limited time and skills. Sociability as generosity exceeds the realm of need and follows directly from our strength of soul, fortitudo, because it expresses a positive power to overcome antisocial passions such as hatred, envy, and the desire for revenge. Spinoza asserts that generous souls resist and overwhelm hostile forces and debilitating affects with wisdom, foresight, and love. The sociability yielded by generosity, then, is not just a form of cooperation we need to survive and produce leisure for study and contemplation. Generosity is not a mere means, but a positive expression of freedom, because it is the activity through which a strong soul and body transforms enemies into friends. It is not an expression of lack, but an acquired power that infuses one's social milieu with empowering love and joy, creating agreements in power where they did not previously exist. Attention to generosity reveals not only that there are social virtues proper to Spinoza's understanding of freedom, but that freedom itself is, by necessity, social. So difficulties in interpretation arise partly because Spinoza's account of finite life as immanent and ineluctably relational implies that freedom is not a binary phenomenon, something we have or do not have, but something that complicates oppositions between activity and passivity, affecting and being affected, which Simon talked about. Anyway. Attention to generosity helps to address the complexity of freedom as both a product of necessity and as a matter of degree. Although I can only provide a small window into the full set of questions raised by the consideration of the relationship between sociability and freedom, I will try to address two. The first is metaphysical and is the primary source of concern for Garber. How can one be understood both to act from one's nature alone and to act with others? How can we reconcile adequate causation with acting through community or convenientia? The second, and that's actually what I spend most of my paper on and what I find is trickier to show. The second point I think is pretty straightforward. But the second point is more phenomenological. The constellation of social virtues that Spinoza names evoke self-limitation: generosity, modesty, clemency, and chastity. How do these traditionally Christian virtues cohere with Spinoza's arguably more Machiavellian conception of virtue? So I will address these two issues in turn. So first section, acting by oneself with others. Spinoza defines virtue as power, or the very essence or nature of man, insofar as he has the power of bringing about certain things which can be understood through the laws of his nature alone. Since only substance acts absolutely without the concurrence of other causes, only God or nature can be understood as entirely self-sufficient, as the exclusive cause of its effects. The complex individuals we call humans do not cause anything absolutely, but they do serve as adequate causes of some of their actions. Spinoza stipulates, quote, "I call that cause adequate, whose effect can clearly and distinctly be perceived through it. But I call it partial or inadequate if its effects cannot be understood through it alone," end quote. Garber interprets human action to be adequate only if it is, in some sense, causally isolated from the world, such that one would affect others without being at the same time affected by them. Since finite beings are never entirely unaffected by others, they can only ever be partially free and rational. He suggests, therefore, that Spinoza's figure of virtue, a man whose acts can be understood through the laws of his nature alone, must be an idealization. When Spinoza attaches reason, freedom, and virtue to sociability, as he does with generosity, Garber suggests that we understand sociability as belonging to the desire for freedom rather than to its achievement. So, sociability must be a condition of possibility for freedom, virtue, and reason, since none of us would live long enough to develop and exercise our powers without care relations embedded within a wider system of social cooperation. Nevertheless, I do not think that Spinoza is being imprecise when he asserts that sociability is also a result of virtue. Generosity is an example of how acting solely under the guidance of reason entails sociability directly. Generosity appears at the end of part 3 of Spinoza's Ethics in his discussion of active affects. While human life is invariably characterized by subjection to the passions and to the common order of nature, we necessarily strive, with more or less success, to do those things that follow from and enhance our particular natures. Active affects express virtue because they are activities that follow from a relationship of forces within a composite individual. An active affect is always related to joy or desire, which means that it indicates an amplification of our power. An affect is active rather than passive when an augmentation in our power can be understood to follow from what we might loosely call interior causes. Rather than explaining an increase in one's power to think and act by a fortunate encounter with external forces, such as the uplift in mood delivered by the warm sun, active affects must be explained by a favorable change in one's ability to think and act that the virtuous agent produces from her own resources. Spinoza describes very few active affects, but among them is generosity. Generosity is defined, as I said, as a desire to aid others and join them to oneself in friendship that is guided solely by reason. Since reason is its exclusive cause, generosity must be understood as an expression of virtue or power, which follows from the laws of one's nature alone. Spinoza calls desire the essence of man, but a human's essence or nature is not typically guided by reason alone. Quote, "The essence of the mind is constituted by adequate and inadequate ideas," end quote. We strive to think and act from confusion and imagination, as well as from clarity and understanding. But when we desire from understanding, we express fortitudo, strength of mind or character, which Spinoza tells us is distinguished by particular active affects, animositas and generositas. Animositas names the rational desire spurred by reason to persevere, and he says, and it aims at the agent's good, or utile. Spinoza's dictates of reason clearly link virtue to the desire to persevere in being, and so there is nothing puzzling about courage or the intelligent desire to persevere being proper to the strength of character. We might note, however, that Spinoza defines the agent's good, utile, in 4p38, as whatever enables the body to affect others and to be affected. The power of the agent for Spinoza seems to include a power of receptivity as well as a power of assertion, which is clear when one considers Spinoza's general rule that our minds grow in sophistication as our bodies become capable of being disposed in increasingly many ways. If what we need in order to think and act more powerfully is an increasingly complex power of receptivity, then causal isolation, or even independence more generally, may not be an apt regulative ideal for becoming free. So even if the free man is an idealization, I don't think its ideal should be one of causal independence. When we conceive of courageous striving as a desire to persevere through affecting and disposing oneself toward being affected in enabling ways, reason's compulsion toward generosity may seem less paradoxical. Spinoza asserts that the agent of virtue is moved by reason to aid other men and join with them in friendship. He doesn't describe generosity primarily as a receptive power, so we ought not understand courage as the active side of reason's striving, in contrast to generosity as the passive side. Both animositas and generositas are active affects, or what a strong-minded character does by virtue of that strength. Generosity follows from the mind insofar as it understands. It does not merely provide the conditions amenable to understanding, but is understanding's effect. While there can be no question that connectivity, such as that between a mother's body and her fetus, brings into being activity, Spinoza insists also that virtuous activity, as generosity, also produces connectivity, or the coming together of diverse agential forces. For Descartes, as Chantal Jaquet points out, helping others is a property of generosity, but not its essence. Cartesian generosity is that esteem that follows from the true understanding that nothing truly belongs to me other than my free control of my volitions. It is a feeling of resolve to use my will well, and only to praise and blame myself or others on the basis of how we dispose our wills. Freedom as free will is at the basis of Cartesian generosity, and sociability is encouraged by generosity, but is not proper to its definition. Thus, the connection between freedom, generosity, and sociability is not as tight in Descartes as it is in Spinoza. Spinozan generosity is defined equally by freedom and sociability. Therefore, its essence is sociability. Since Spinoza plainly rejects freedom as the free control of one's volitions, we are operating with a different understanding of both generosity and freedom. I don't have to worry about Dan fighting me. Freedom for Spinoza is not a faculty proper to our kind, identical in each human being, aligning him or her with God. Freedom or virtue is the power to act from the necessary laws of one's nature. Generally, for finite modes, the power to exist and act is something that arises between us by virtue of the necessary laws that govern our shared existence. A singular finite mode, quote 1p28, can neither exist nor act unless it has been determined to exist and produce an effect by another cause, which also has a determinate and finite existence, end quote. We only exist and act at all because we are involved with infinitely many other finite beings, and we are more or less active to the extent that we concur with those other finite beings. The powers of our minds and bodies are especially affected by those with whom we are most similar, those with whom, for example, we form a household and our neighbors, or those with whom we spend the most time. Thus, Spinoza observes that, quote, if someone lives among such individuals as agree with his nature, his power of acting will thereby be aided and encouraged. On the other hand, if he is among men who do not at all agree with his nature, he will hardly be able to accommodate himself to them without greatly changing himself, end quote. The concurrence or hostility of ambient modes is to a great extent a matter of fortune, or that which exceeds our power. Since we cannot but imitate the affects of those around us, at least to some extent, especially those whose bodies and minds share the most with our own, the extent to which we can preserve and increase our power is strongly affected by the virtue of those around us. Even if one necessarily finds oneself in a social milieu that amplifies one's power more or less, the ability of those among us to move us with joy and wisdom may be owed to their generosity. Generosity for Spinoza is the capacity to transform others through the exercise of one's own joyful wisdom, an ability which follows necessarily from virtue. Spinoza observes that because among singular things we know nothing more excellent than a man who is guided by reason, we can best show how much our skill, ours, and understanding, this is ingenio, are worth, by educating men so that at last they live according to the command of their own reason, end quote. As often happens, Spinoza's remarks immediately acknowledge the contrary as well. People can be awful, can oppose one another bitterly, and are more dangerous than other individuals in nature. Spinoza continues, quote, "Minds, however, are conquered not by arms, but by love and generosity," end quote. He proceeds to remark on the supreme utility of friendship, but warns that skill and alertness, ars et vigilantia, are necessary for this. The value of reason then appears in the generous power of sociability, a practical art of producing and strengthening friendships by bringing others to the threshold of their own reason. When one acts to enhance the concurrence of powers among neighbors, we may understand this to be something that follows from one's nature, even if it ought not to be attributed to an individual's exclusive activity. Let us observe with Balibar that when Spinoza elaborates his definition of conatus as the actual essence of each thing, he says, and this of course is 3p6d, "From the given essence of each thing, some things necessarily follow, and things are able to produce nothing but what follows from their determinate nature. So the power of each thing, or the striving by which it, and in parentheses, either alone or with others, does anything, is nothing but the actual essence of the thing." Spinoza defines the essence of an actual thing not only by what it accomplishes independently, but also by what it brings about through the concurrence of activity with others. This suggests that our nature is not circumscribed by what we customarily think of as our anthropomorphic individuality. Moreover, what can be understood through the laws of our nature alone is not necessarily what can be attributed to our exclusive authorship. Generosity, I suggest, is that power to generate convenientia, such that the scope of what follows from our nature is enlarged. Freedom as necessary activity, rather than as given faculty, involves the alignment and coordination of diverse powers. Generosity is one such description of the skill by which commonality and convenientia are brought into being. And my second section is short. Militant generosity. So today we associate generosity with benevolence, altruism, and supererogatory acts. Several of the affects that Spinoza associates with fortitudo likewise may suggest renunciation and self-limitation more than vitality and power. The subspecies of courage and generosity, sobriety, moderation, modesty, chastity, they don't sound very fun, are not what we typically associate with self-actualization. Despite the Christian resonance of pointing to modesty and chastity as expressions of the soul's power, Spinoza's ethics, in my view at least, do not paint a portrait of freedom as a spiritual fortress, a power to disengage from the trivialities of earthly life and a determination to retreat into the self. On my interpretation, Spinoza does not advocate the maxim of Descartes' provisional morality, recommending that we work more on ourselves than on fortune. Or perhaps better, Spinoza recommends that we work on the forces of fortune such that they may become our own. I suggest that Spinoza's account of generosity and the affects that flow from it, modestia and clementia, implies Spinoza's relatively activist posture toward fortune. We will see again that freedom as a social power calls further into question the boundaries between the powers we attribute to others and those we might rightfully call our own. Spinoza defines modestia as, quote, a desire to do what pleases men and not what displeases them, which is sort of a funny definition of modesty. But modesty, he says, is a species of ambition, which is defined in precisely the same way, but it's not typically guided by reason. Ambition often prompts us to please others through impressing them, distinguishing ourselves, and endeavoring to display our superiority. Yet the desire to be a source of joy to others expresses strength when guided by reason because it involves the skill and temperament that produce an enduring augmentation in their power to think and act. Rather than briefly producing joy through a spectacular act, modestia produces joy in others through offering a more enduring and complete pleasure, like, for example, the ability to identify plants or interpret text. Modestia is among those joys we produce in others, not through impressing upon them our heroic distinction, but through enjoying together those goods that are more enjoyable the more they are shared. But because, as Spinoza frequently laments, social life often involves being harmed by others, remaining determined by active affects rather than sad passions also requires clementia, mercy. We need that strength of character that enables us, quote, to bear men's wrongs calmly and apply our zeal to those things which help to bring men together in friendship, end quote. If we remind ourselves frequently that, quote, men, like other things, act from the necessity of nature, even Donald Trump, then the wrong or the hate usually arising from it will occupy a very small part of the imagination and easily, or not so easily, be overcome, end quote. So when Descartes contends that generosity disposes one to interpret another's acts as following from her free will, Spinoza declares that imagining one another to be determined by necessity is what promises to deliver us from hatred, envy, mockery, and other sad passions. Clementia is a power of mind because it is grounded in understanding men, including oneself, quote, as they really are and not as we would like them to be, end quote. Through appreciating the rich network of causes within which humans operate, we are freed from the misery of a life fueled by hatred and vengeance. Spinoza thus contrasts the desire for retribution, revenge, and war with generosity. Generosity is an alternative, non-belligerent mode by which we can overcome hostile forces, or at least the fortitudinous can. Nonetheless, when Spinoza declares that the other's hate should not be repaid in kind, but should be conquered by love and generosity, he uses rather martial language. Generosity involves actively disrupting and overpowering the violence of social antagonism. In Spinoza's words, quote, one who is eager to overcome hate by love strives joyously and confidently, resists many men as easily as one. Very struck by that. Those whom he conquers will yield joyously, not from lack of strength, but from an increase in their powers, end quote. So generosity, most essentially, is that power to turn haters into lovers, transmuting hostile forces into one's own arms. More evocative of Machiavelli's prince than of Jesus Christ, Spinozan generosity is not a spiritual largesse that humbly defers judgment to God. Rather, generosity actively works on and against the forces of hatred to produce new alignments of shared power, pleasure, and knowledge. Generosity conveys strength rather than weakness, power rather than need. If we reflect on Spinoza's remarks that in a hostile environment, it is very difficult, he says even hardly possible, to withstand the desire to react with hatred or cruelty. Joining others to oneself is not only a matter of having more hands to accomplish what yours alone cannot. It is primarily a matter of responding to adversity with love rather than weakness. To join others to ourselves, especially those others who provoke intense, sad passions in us, requires a powerful soul and body, a mode of being that is not easily perturbed, upset, or disintegrated by trauma. Instead, the generous emit joy and desire so powerfully that instead of imitating the hatred of others, those same others imitate the generous, yielding joyously. Because their hostility yields to admiration, those who might have been enemies become friends. Generosity forges relations of agreement where they did not previously exist. The strong of soul exercise generosity when, rather than being changed by adversity, they overwhelm it with their own joyful radiations. In overcoming the hostile affects of others, modest generosity upsets the push-pull of struggles for domination with a common striving for shared power and joy. It is only great virtue and power that can reorder not only one's perspective on fortune, but fortune itself.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Ariel Suhamy.
Merci beaucoup Hasana pour cette présentation de la générosité. Alors je suis un peu ennuyé parce que Pierre-François Moreau nous disait hier qu'il espérait bien qu'il y aurait des conflits d'interprétation parce que la vérité ne naît, selon le traité politique, que des désaccords et des oppositions plutôt que des agreements préalables. Et donc je suis malheureux d'avoir à dire que je me trouve entièrement d'accord avec tout ce que vous venez de nous dire. Et que je vais avoir
très généreux de ta part.
Voilà, on va jouer sur la générosité. Et on va voir si la générosité peut aller jusqu'à ce. Enfin, on va voir d'ailleurs, parce que je vais quand même évoquer la question justement du désaccord et du conflit, puisque c'est là-dessus que part votre intervention. Et puis, il peut aussi arriver que certains accords produisent du désaccord. On a vu hier comment notre ami Steve Barbon avait présenté à Alexandre Matron une thèse qu'il pensait pouvoir tirer de ses prémices et que Matron l'avait entièrement désavoué. Donc, ça peut arriver qu'un accord débouche en fait sur un désaccord. Personnellement, si Matron m'avait fait une telle remarque, ça m'aurait amené à revoir tout mon raisonnement, mais parfois il est difficile de savoir si on s'est bien compris. Plus difficile peut-être que savoir si on est en désaccord. Alors, je dois faire un aveu avant tout, c'est que je me suis au fond demandé, à propos de votre entrée en matière, pourquoi vous commenciez par discuter un argument que personnellement, pour ma part, j'aurais eu tendance à rejeter d'emblée tout de suite, parce qu'il me semblait doublement erroné au regard de la doctrine spinoziste telle que je la comprends. Puisque d'une part, il me semble bien connu que Spinoza n'identifie pas la causalité adéquate avec l'indépendance causale ou l'autosuffisance. Seule la substance, vous l'avez rappelé, est susceptible d'assumer cette identification. Et puis d'autre part, si on peut effectivement attribuer la cause universelle de la société, ou plutôt pour être plus précis, le retour à la société, comme le dit le paragraphe 1 du chapitre 6 du traité politique, si on peut attribuer cette cause à la nécessité, au besoin et à la peur de la solitude, cela n'implique pas que toute sociabilité se réduise au besoin et à cette crainte de la solitude, puisque Spinoza donne deux autres motivations au moins. D'une part, dans le même chapitre, les affects de la multitude, il en énonce trois, la peur, la vengeance d'un mal subi en commun ou l'espoir. Et d'autre part, la raison elle-même qui dispose l'homme libre à suivre le commandement commun plutôt que la solitude où il n'obéit qu'à lui-même. Éthique 4, 73. Et alors, bien entendu, ce dernier motif, le motif rationnel, n'est pas universel ni universalisable. À mon avis, d'ailleurs, le second non plus, c'est-à-dire que la multitude non plus n'est pas universelle ni universalisable, enfin, je ne sais pas là-dessus. Autrement dit, la société elle-même ne peut pas s'expliquer entièrement par ce motif rationnel, il ne vaut que pour les quelques hommes qui sont conduits par la raison. Mais cela n'empêche pas qu'il peut jouer ce rôle de la raison, un rôle capital dans une société donnée, comme par exemple l'illustre la conclusion du traité théologico-politique. Et enfin, si le traité politique, comme le traité théologico-politique, affirme que la liberté est la fin de la vie politique, cela ne signifie évidemment pas que celle-ci prenne fin avec la liberté, qui en serait comme le dépassement ou l'horizon. Je pense qu'on peut faire justice de cette interprétation, mais plutôt que la liberté ne peut s'effectuer réellement et en acte qu'au sein d'une société donnée, quand bien même celle-ci serait pénétrée de passion et d'irrationalité, comme l'est d'ailleurs toujours toute société. Et il me semble que c'est dans le passage justement du plus au moins que se joue l'action de la générosité. Peut-être qu'on pourrait dire d'ailleurs que cette intervention de la générosité permet le passage de cet affect de crainte ou de vengeance à l'affect d'espoir, mais là, ça nous entraînerait ailleurs. Donc, je reviens à ma première impression, et j'insiste parce que peut-être ça permettra de mettre en évidence des différences méthodologiques, entre ce que j'appellerais, pour faire le court et sans doute très caricatural, il faut bien lancer le débat, l'école française et l'école américaine. Parce que, de mon point de vue, je me dirais, il suffit de le renvoyer au texte, et puis la discussion est close. Devant des thèses aussi provocantes que celles que vous commencez par évoquer, j'aurais donc personnellement tendance à dire, non, ça ne marche pas comme ça chez Spinoza, et puis c'est tout. Autrement dit, j'aurais tendance à me retrancher derrière la logique du système, peut-être à m'ériger comme gardien du système, à me transformer en censeur, et je vois tout de suite que cette attitude ne serait pas très généreuse, justement, au sens spinoziste du terme. Parce qu'elle partirait non pas de ce qui peut m'unir avec l'adversaire, mais plutôt avec ce qui oppose, elle partirait de la négation, ou pour reprendre la métaphore militaire que vous signalez, l'adversaire serait peut-être à terme vaincu, mais certainement pas vaincu par un surcroît de force, pas de bon gré, mais donc tout en maugréant, il reconnaîtrait peut-être son erreur, mais il en garderait sans doute rancune, et continuerait de penser que de toute façon Spinoza se contredit. Alors vous, au contraire, justement, sans vous opposer directement à l'argumentation de Garber, vous proposez, quant à vous, un long développement pour approfondir l'idée d'une sociabilité raisonnable, c'est-à-dire de ce que la raison peut apporter à la société à travers de l'analyse de l'affect de générosité. Et vous vous placez pour répondre d'emblée sur un autre terrain, et cela me paraît d'ailleurs original parmi toutes les contributions que nous avons entendues, parce que vous vous situez non pas sur la simple discussion, sur le terrain de la simple discussion théorique ou du jeu des concepts fondamentaux, des concepts que l'on trouve par exemple dans l'éthique 1, ce dont il a été beaucoup question dans ce colloque, mais plutôt sur les implications pratiques et éthiques du spinozisme. Et donc, votre approche, elle, on peut dire qu'elle est effectivement généreuse. Puisqu'il ne s'agit pas pour vous de corriger une erreur en mettant le doigt sur des insuffisances de raisonnement, mais de brosser positivement un tableau de la générosité qui répond finalement mieux que toute discussion pointilleuse. Donc, je constate un accord sur le fond, mais j'ai manifestement beaucoup de choses à apprendre de votre manière de procéder. Alors donc, passons à cette manière de procéder, qui me semble très intéressante, puisque vous procédez là encore par contraste, non plus par discussion avec M. Garber, mais en faisant un contraste entre la générosité cartésienne et celle de Spinoza. La conception que se font ces deux philosophes de cette même notion. Alors, j'aurais beaucoup à dire, mais il y a un point qui me frappe particulièrement, c'est la question de l'égalité. La générosité cartésienne, vous la présentez, et elle apparaît comme un principe d'égalité fondamentale. C'est-à-dire nous reconnaissons et nous admirons en autrui une faculté libre dont tous disposent à égalité, quel que soit l'usage qu'il en font. Tous les hommes, on pourrait dire, naissent libres et donc égaux par cette capacité de liberté, et donc la générosité apparaît comme une sorte d'égale dignité partagée par tous les hommes. On pourrait même dire que la générosité cartésienne est un peu à l'image du bon sens, le fameux bon sens qui ouvre le discours de la méthode, qui est comment c'est la chose la mieux partagée, précisément en ce que chacun s'en croit suffisamment pourvu pour s'en contenter. Alors, sans doute, le propos est ironique, mais il décrit aussi une réalité effective. Et on sait le rôle que ce principe de préférence individuelle pour sa propre opinion, également répartie, joue dans des philosophies du contrat telles que celle de Hobbes, que Descartes approuvait quant à lui, quant à la politique. Alors, je ne peux pas trancher dans le débat qu'on a lancé hier pour savoir si le spinozisme est une philosophie de l'individu ou de la communauté, débat lancé par Laurent Bove, sous la voix de Charles Ramond. Mais on peut en tout cas difficilement douter que Descartes et Hobbes soient des individualistes. La générosité cartésienne est fondée sur cette conscience d'une faculté que nous possédons d'emblée et qui nous distingue de tous les autres êtres vivants et qui fait donc de tout autre homme un égal. Donc la générosité est fondamentalement individualiste. Et comme vous le montrez, ce n'est que dans un second temps, chez Descartes, qu'elle s'adresse à un bénéficiaire qui peut éventuellement profiter de ses fruits. Face à ce schéma cartésien, vous montrez que la conception spinoziste de la générosité brouille les catégories jusqu'à même renverser complètement la donne. Et d'abord, elle apparaît au contraire comme un principe d'inégalité, ou en tout cas d'asymétrie. Le généreux spinoziste, tel qu'il est défini par Spinoza, fait effort pour gagner les autres hommes à une position qu'il occupe, donc pour les transformer, pour les faire advenir à une raison qu'ils n'ont pas. On pourrait se demander d'ailleurs chez Spinoza ce que signifierait une générosité entre égaux. Est-ce qu'il y a-t-il seulement une générosité entre les égaux? On a le sentiment que la générosité est d'emblée inégalitaire. Et on peut dire que peut-être Spinoza dit de la générosité ce que Descartes disait de l'amour, à savoir qu'il tend fondamentalement à se communiquer. Donc à la valeur cartésienne qui est distribuée également chez tous, la libre volonté qui nous rend l'égal de Dieu, se substitue l'art et l'ingenium, l'art et ingenium, qui sont inégalement répartis chez les uns et les autres. Et ce qui chez Hobbes est principe de guerre, l'opinion de chacun, la volonté de chacun à faire valoir son opinion, chez Spinoza reste un principe de guerre, mais ici la guerre peut déboucher sur une victoire commune. Alors ceci, ça me frappe parce qu'on a tendance à présenter Spinoza comme un grand partisan de l'égalité. On sait bien que il présente par exemple la démocratie comme le meilleur régime parce qu'il est le plus proche de l'égalité dont disposent les hommes à l'état de nature. Mais je pense aussi à d'autres textes, par exemple dans l'éthique 470 Scoli, qui fait remarquer que les hommes passionnés exigent l'égalité dans l'échange. C'est justement ça qui est redoutable avec eux, parce que leur amitié n'est pas un véritable échange, ce n'est qu'un commerce ou une piperie, c'est-à-dire autrement dit ça relève du potlatch, du donnant-donnant. Donc il y a quelque chose de néfaste en fait dans l'égalité, dans les échanges égaux. S'il y a quelque chose d'égal chez Spinoza, c'est, qui fonde la générosité, ce n'est plus à chercher dans les sujets qui partageraient une même dignité de base, mais dans l'objet qui crée le bien commun, puisque le bien commun est défini en 436 comme ceux dont chacun peut jouir également. Donc ce n'est pas l'action du généreux, c'est l'objet de la jouissance, qui, quel qu'il soit, d'ailleurs, parce que chacun en jouira à son degré, mais néanmoins on en jouira toujours également, c'est-à-dire sans rivalité pour l'arracher à autrui. Et dernier point, toujours dans cette même direction, je constate que la liberté que revendique Spinoza, ce n'est pas seulement une liberté de penser, mais toujours aussi d'enseigner, c'est-à-dire effectivement de convertir autrui à la pensée du bien commun. Donc je crois qu'on est assez loin ici de la pensée d'un pur individualisme ou d'un libéralisme, où toutes les pensées pourraient coexister dans un apaisement des conflits sous la protection du Léviathan. Au contraire, la société spinoziste, elle exige les débats les plus violents. Il me reste un peu de temps. Plus beaucoup. Alors je vais terminer très rapidement par l'idée, à mon avis, la plus intéressante de votre intervention, et qui me semble assez provocante pour les lecteurs de Deleuze que nous sommes, qui d'ailleurs, je crois, empruntait cette idée à Alki. C'est l'idée des bonnes rencontres. Deleuze a insisté beaucoup là-dessus, sur l'idée que le devenir actif passait par la recherche des bonnes rencontres ou de l'art d'organiser les bonnes rencontres. Je suppose qu'il voulait dire des bonnes rencontres avec nos semblables, ou du moins quelque chose qui ont avec nous des intérêts communs avec d'autres spinozistes, dans des colloques par exemple, etc. Alors que ce que vous montrez, c'est plutôt que la générosité consiste pas, enfin le devenir actif ne consiste pas tant à organiser de bonnes rencontres que doit transformer les rencontres, quelles qu'elles soient, qui se présentent à nous, ce que vous avez appelé la fortune, effectivement. Donc, là encore, opposition à l'adage cartésien, stoïco-cartésien, qui demande de modifier nos désirs plutôt que l'ordre du monde. Au contraire, pour Spinoza, tout est affaire d'interprétation des événements et des rencontres, donc de la fortune. Donc, il ne s'agit pas de se creuser une petite niche ou une communauté souterraine qui échapperait à l'ordre commun du monde, à l'ordre social en particulier, mais plutôt de faire usage de la fortune pour qu'elle devienne notre propre élément, de manière à changer tant soit peu l'ordre du monde ou l'ordre social par la seule puissance du désir rationnel. C'est que, comme vous le montrez aussi, la rencontre ne fait pas qu'augmenter la puissance d'agir, elle augmente aussi la capacité d'être affecté. Donc la puissance ne se définit pas effectivement par l'autosuffisance, elle se définit par l'ouverture à tout ce qui peut affecter et dont la raison peut se nourrir. Et donc je vous remercie de l'avoir très largement alimenté.
Merci. Your turn, Hasana. Yes, I know, Dan, you are, of course, the first speaker, and then somebody next to you, and then in the rear. But we are very tight with the time, so take that into account.
Just very fast, thank you very much for your response. I think the very interesting issue you raise is the question of equality. So does this, whereas generosity for Descartes has its basis in a kind of moral attitude of respect towards the other, Spinozan generosity here seems to be grounded in these differences. And I don't know if one reason Curley selected nobility was because it does kind of implies this impressiveness. There's some kind of superiority of character or soul to the one who has fortitude, or maybe. But I chose the term. I chose the translation generosity because I was interested in comparison with Descartes. So I wanted to make the philological connection. But also because I was wary of how nobility does sound like this doctrine of kind of inequality, and I'm always anxious about the potential for elitist and anti-populist reinterpretations of Spinoza's ethics. But I do think. Sorry, I'm not doing it fast enough.
No, go ahead. I'm allowing another 10 minutes, and we'll cut the pause.
But I do think that there is as you say, I think there's an accent here on freedom over any kind of given equality, and around the arrival at the enjoyment of an equal or common good, rather than the recognition of a given equal status or something like that. So I think it's a different accent in Spinoza. And this is just an aside that in 20th century feminist interpretations of Spinoza, most of the feminists are they're in the school of the sexual difference feminism. So a feminism that doesn't emphasize equality of the sexes, but emphasizes there being sort of irreducible differences, corporeal differences, and trying to think about transformative relationships in light of these kinds of irreducible differences. And so I think there's a reason why they're attracted to Spinoza, and I think that there is this element there.
Big problem. Okay, we have Dan Garber, then you, and then Denis Combuchner. First three interventions. C'est qui la droite de Dan Garber?
Thank you very much, Hasana, for your very generous remarks and for your attempt to bring me to a higher reference on these questions. I am not really committed to the paper, which I actually wrote 25 years ago, even though it was only published, I think, 11 or 12 years ago. And I must admit I had to reread it to remind myself what I wrote. But I still think that there is a tension, at very least. I think you have shown a very interesting strand in Spinoza's thought, but I still wonder about the free man. And in ethics for Proposition 68 demonstration, he says, I call him free, who is led by reason alone. And says, the free man has only adequate ideas. And this does suggest a kind of causal isolation, which may in the end be incoherent. It certainly is inconsistent with what he says, I think, he certainly suggests earlier on in Ethics 4 that such a person is impossible. And insofar as this is the model of the human nature that we're supposed to be imitating, isn't there still going to be a tension between generosity? In particular, you talk about the generous person getting joy from the increase. Joy is passive affect.
It's both.
No.
Yeah, love of God is
Well, but the thing is, the kind of joy that you get from raising another person to a higher state is not the kind of joy that you get in the love of God, I think, which is positive, but it will be a kind of passive affect. Isn't there still at very least a tension? Steve Nadler in a recent paper attempts to argue that the free man actually is capable of having passions of a certain sort, though not acting on them. And I'm not sure that works.
Okay, so first I'll say I absolutely 100% agree that there is no living human being who is guided solely by reason. The thing that I haven't been able to work out and that I've dreamt of trying to show forever, so please help me. So the thing where I very much disagree with you, but I haven't figured out how to show it convincingly, is the idea that reason would be causal isolation. So I think that the doctrine of the common notions grounds reason in the contrary of causal isolation. So it grounds reason in that which we have first in common with all of nature, and then we're more reasonable the more we have properties in common with others. And the whole sort of process of becoming a body and mind capable of knowing more things is producing more commonalities. So I think, like, my strongest point of disagreement with you is I actually think that we need an interpretation of reason that is not causal isolation, but something like causal connection, identity, even something like that. So that, I think that's really the
Yes, I think
the
that
main
that's
site.
exactly what you would need.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you would need in order to get the interpretation up, but I'm not certain that you can make it work for Spinoza.
Yeah, I think it's 2p38, 2p39, 2p39c, and I think there's a developmental narrative you can tell, and also a kind of absolute narrative. But it is tricky.
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
Knox Peden.
Merci. Hasana, I thought that was very, very good. I was persuaded by the reading. I agree with Ariel. It was very generous. Until right at the tail end, when you had this description of overwhelming someone with joyful radiations.
Yeah.
And it's kind of creepy. I'm always on the other side of that, and that has the potential to be horrible. To have someone overwhelming me with their joyful radiations. And it made me think about the word that is never to be uttered at Spinoza conferences, which is autonomy. Like, what happens to autonomy in the situation? And the figure who does not want to be overwhelmed or shown generosity. And obviously this is related to the other name you can't say here, which is Kant. And the fears about a Spinozist enthusiasm, a fanaticism, a Schwärmerei of reason. And because your account of generosity is built in this extension of reason via sociality, these are precisely the kinds of things that liberals of all stripes, and also not just liberals, are really, really worried about.
Yeah.
About that aspect of it. So I just want to know your response to those challenges.
So your problem is not that what I said was false, but that it's bad.
Well, it's a question for
Yeah,
Spinoza.
but that it's disturbing. Yeah. So I think Spinoza is a perfectionist. I don't think Kantians will be happy with Spinoza on various points. And I do think, in line with Stephen Nadler's paper, I think there are disabling joyful radiations and there are enabling joyful radiations. So some people's joyful radiations could indeed be like having a bad rich meal that's really pleasant at the time but messes you up later on. And then there are those kinds of joyful radiations that really do increase your power to think and act. And that's objective. That's an objective phenomenon. That's something. It's incredibly difficult to know, and that's why we break up with people at some point. That's why we fall in love with a new philosopher, and that's why we have to make changes in our lives because some things may be temporarily fortifying but not ultimately fortifying, etc. And I do admit that it does have that disturbing tone. But how did you get into this stuff? It was because of someone's joyful radiations.
Sorry to press you. Denis Cambouchner.
Merci à tous les deux. Comme vous avez tous les deux évoqué la différence entre la générosité spinoziste et la générosité cartésienne, je voudrais très brièvement plaider la cause du rapprochement entre les deux auteurs. Pour une raison simple, aussi claire est l'opposition s'agissant du libre arbitre, autant l'opposition s'agissant de la sociabilité me semble pas évidente. Je ne tiens pas pour évident qu'il y ait une secondarité de la sociabilité par rapport à la liberté chez Descartes. Il me semble qu'il y a une espèce d'illusion d'optique qui est liée d'une part à la projection sur les passions de l'âme du dispositif des méditations et d'autre part à l'ordre d'exposition des passions de l'âme où la première question c'est effectivement celle du véritable objet de l'objet légitime de l'estime et particulièrement de l'estime de soi. Oui. Mais juste après, évidemment, Descartes dit parce que les généreux n'estiment rien de plus grand que de faire du bien aux autres hommes, oui. etc. Ils sont parfaitement courtois, affables et officieux envers chacun. Phrase merveilleuse. Ça n'est pas un aspect secondaire. La preuve en étant que dans le discours de la méthode 6e partie, il est question à répétition de la loi qui nous oblige, autant qu'il est en nous, quantum in nobis est, dans la traduction latine, à procurer le bien général de tous les hommes. Et ça revient plusieurs fois dans la 6e partie, c'est un thème extrêmement insistant. De sorte qu'on peut soutenir que si formellement l'intérêt du généreux se porte vers l'usage de son libre arbitre, son action et sa pensée ont un objet qui est le bien commun. Et à cet égard, il me semble que la proximité avec un certain nombre de différences indéniables entre les deux dispositions est plus forte qu'on ne le penserait à première vue et qu'elle se confirmerait sur un certain nombre de points que vous avez évoqués par la suite. Autrement dit, si je peux ajouter un mot, Isaac disait hier matin que Spinoza n'avait jamais été cartésien, c'est sûrement vrai en métaphysique, c'est moins vrai en morale, et ça dès le cours traité.
I need to ask you to give a short reply.
Yeah. First, I don't want to strawman Descartes, and it is very easy to do that, to make just base the contrast in free will. And I think that you're right that when you think, for example, about acquiescentia in, say, ipso, and Cartesian generosity, I think there's more alignment with Spinoza and Descartes. But when you think precisely of his concept of generosity against the concept of generosity, they come apart more. But I think on the question of esteeming yourself for the right reasons, for the genuine exercise of your power, I think they come close.
Bravo. Super.